So, how do these groups compare with other minority groups? Well, unlike the situation of African Americans in the 1600s and Mexican Americans in the 1800s, the dominant group had no desire to control the labor of these groups. Unlike Native Americans, Chinese Americans, Japanese Americans in the early 20th century presented no military danger to the larger society, so there was little concern with their activities once the economic threat had been eliminated. So Chinese and Japanese Americans had the ingredients and experiences necessary to form successful enclaves. Immigration from Asia has been considerable since the 1960s and continues to increase. As was the case with Hispanic immigrants, the sending nations, other than Japan, are considerably less developed than the United States. And the primary motivation for most of these immigrants is economic. However, unlike Hispanic immigration, the Asian immigrant stream also includes a large contingent of highly educated professionals seeking opportunities to practice their careers and expand their skills. What are some other factors besides the economic factors that attract these immigrants? Many Asian immigrants are the spouses of American military personnel. There are also a number of immigrants from India, many of whom are highly educated and highly skilled. Refugees from Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos, many of whom lived in the camps and relocation centers for years before immigrating to the United States. And because of these conditions of their escape from their homelands, they typically bring little in the way of human or material capital with them. For example, Vietnamese Americans have a socioeconomic profile that in some ways resembles those of non-Asian racial minorities in the United States. So if you come in under a refugee status, you're most likely going to be poor. You're most likely not going to have high levels of education and the potential for high levels of economic success. Of course, prejudice and discrimination are key aspects of the minority experience. American prejudice against Asians first became prominent in the 19th century. The Chinese were seen as a threat to the working class, to American democracy, and to other American institutions, for example. Many of these stereotypes and fears transferred to the Japanese later in the 19th century and then to other Asian groups as they arrived in the United States. If I had to guess, this probably is related to the way they look. Distinctive, visible characteristics can identify you in a group that might be incorrect. But nevertheless, the perceptions of those that are willing to allow their prejudice to take the form of discrimination, it's immaterial. A recent survey suggests that discrimination and prejudice are not perceived as major problems by most Asian Americans. The question of that is this due to downplaying the issue? Or is this group really experiencing less discrimination? And then, of course, you have to wonder about the positive stereotyping of Asian Americans as seen as that model minority, which, of course, shows them in a favorable light. This brings us to acculturation and structural assimilation. The extent of acculturation of Asian Americans is highly variable. The great variability both within and between these groups makes it difficult to characterize their overall degree of acculturation. In some groups, you see not a whole lot of acculturation. In other groups, you see a lot of acculturation. Asian Americans in general are highly urbanized, a reflection of their entry conditions into the United States. Asian American groups are generally less residentially segregated as well than either African American or Hispanic Americans. This might be due to some of them being really economically successful, but it also has to do with the conditions of the other minority group experiences in the United States as well. This is the distribution of Asian Americans in the United States in 2010. As you see, Asian Americans tend to reside on either coast and around Los Angeles, San Francisco, and New York. This is where big population centers, so this is not surprising. The 2000 census showed that more than 96% of the Asian American population were living in metropolitan areas, and about 48% lived in central city areas. So not only are they living within the not only are they in large metropolitan areas, but they're actually located in the city. As a group, Asian Americans are less concentrated in central city neighborhoods than blacks and Puerto Ricans, but much more than Cuban Americans and non-Hispanic whites. The degree of residential segregation for Asian American groups varies by group and by region. What are some gender and physical aspects of the acculturation process? Is this the Anglo ideal? A number of studies document the feelings of inadequacy and negative self-images that result when minority group members, especially women, compare themselves to the Anglo standards of attractiveness and beauty that dominate U.S. culture. Asian American women, like all women in this still paternalistic society, are pressured by the cultural message that physical beauty should be among their most important concerns. As racial minorities, they're also subjected to the additional message that they are inadequate by Anglo standards, and that some of their most characteristic physical traits are devalued, indeed ridiculed in the society. For Asian American women, the attempt to comply with Anglo standards of beauty may include, of course, cosmetic surgery to sculpt their noses or to open up their eyes. But this is this is a problem for all women. There is some sort of Anglo standard or a certain beauty a woman must possess, and whether you're Asian American, Hispanic American, African American, or white American, or Caucasian American, I guess. If you're a woman, you are subject to these social pressures. It's part of the reason why plastic surgery is such a lucrative profession to be in. Education is another important aspect. The extent of schooling for Asian Americans is very different from that of other racial minority groups, at least when you first look at it. Asian Americans as a whole compare favorably with society-wide standards for educational achievement, and they are above those standards on many measures. Asian American children experience less school segregation than Hispanics and Black American children, although the extent of segregation for this population may have increased in recent years because of high rates of immigration and residential concentration, particularly in large cities. So the more that the other comes in, the more likely the dominant society is going to start to pay attention. And when they pay attention, they draw lines that start to segregate and push back against the successes of this growing group. Political power. The ability of Asian Americans to pursue their group's interest has been sharply limited by a number of factors, including their relatively small size, institutionalized discrimination, the same kinds of racist practices that have limited the power, resources, and other minority groups of color. However, contrary to the perception that Asian Americans are a quiet minority, the group has a long history of political action, including civil rights movements in the 60s and the 70s. Political power of Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders today is also limited by their high percentage of foreign-born members. There are signs of the group's power of the group, or there are signs of the group's power of the group, especially in areas where they are most residentially concentrated. This is distribution of household incomes. Asian Americans, or Asian Indians, sorry, are doing the best. The Hmong are doing the worst. But overall, all groups seem to be performing pretty well. Poverty in 2012 in reference to these groups. As you can imagine, this is the flip side of that chart. Japanese and Asian Indians and Filipinos are experiencing the least amount of poverty, and the Hmong, the Cambodians, the Laotians, the Vietnamese, and the Pakistanis. The Hmong, Cambodians, Laotians, and Vietnamese, of course, are all coming in, or many are coming in reference to refugee status. So you can assume that they're going to do worse than those that are coming in with more human capital. How does this play out in reference to jobs and income? Well, the occupational profiles of Asian American groups tend to sustain the image of success. Both men and women are overrepresented in the highest occupational categories. This is consistent with educational qualifications and occupational profiles. They tend to have higher median yearly incomes than other minority groups, and their pattern of income distribution is bipolar. That is, they are overrepresented in both the highest and the lowest income groups. While the poverty levels of all Asian Americans, considered as a single group, are comparable to Hispanic whites, several of the groups have much higher rates of poverty, especially for children. Japanese, or as we have seen in the other figures, Japanese, Filipinos, and Indian Americans are much more successful, but other groups have poverty levels comparable to colonized racial minority groups. And as I said, if you come in under some sort of refugee status, it's going to be really hard to work your way out of that poverty. We find levels of integration at the primary level for Asian Americans. These are highly variable from group to group. Japanese Americans tend to be the most integrated of all groups. One study found that Japanese Americans were the most likely to have friends outside of their group and to marry across group lines. Same study found that as a whole, it would be the same study found that this would be expected. Integration at the primary level was lower for the foreign-born and those with English language, or with less English language ability. So how successful are Asian Americans, and ultimately at what cost? Remember, we refer to them as the model minority, which can be exaggerated, especially if you don't accept the fact that this is a bipolarized group. First, the group is concentrated in cities where the cost of living is very high. Second, per capita income for Asian Americans is lower than the national average. Third, researchers commonly find that Asian Americans get lower income returns for their years of schooling and earn less than whites on the same educational level. And they also Asian Americans face a glass ceiling that limits their access. And finally, while it might seem that their model minority stereotype is that stereotype is benign and positive, it can also have serious negative consequences.